Are you ready to say goodbye to the constant ups and downs of the artist income roller coaster? Whether you're a full-time artist who wants to increase and stabilize your income, a part-time musician who wants to go full-time, or a hobbyist who needs to fund your passion projects, this podcast will equip you with the tools, resources, and inspiration to make it happen. My name is Bree Noble. I'm a musician, best-selling author, and educator whose mission is to help musicians like you to increase the income you're already making and tap into new income streams so you can create a more diverse, stable, reliable income from music and finally ditch the starving artist mentality. Now let's dive into the Profitable Musician Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Bree Noble, and I am here today with Bill Mullin from Significant Media and Music. And this is going to be a treat because he has been in the industry for over 40 years. So there's so much that we can unpack, so much that we can learn from his experiences. And I think the first way we do that is we hear his story. We figure out how he got from where he started to here. Because I know many of you are like maybe in the beginnings of your career, or you're at a crossroads, you're at maybe a point where you're at like an inflection point, a pivot point, and you're wondering, where do I go from here? And I think we can really learn from other people's stories. So Bill, I would love to have you just kind of give everybody, take them through your journey. How did you start in music and how did you end up where you are today?
Well, thanks. You're going to hear what might look like a checkered past, various ways that I survived and in some cases thrived within the business. I want to start with turning your folks on to something that I think would be a good resource, having considered what you're trying to do to aid them in their own survival skills and their own artist development. And it's a book by a guy I know, David Ruttenberg, and it's called The Music Career You Don't Have Yet. And within that, it really looks at a holistic approach to how you can make ends meet, how you can nurture your skill set in terms of the business side, as well as the music, and even in the area of promotion and those types of things. And he cites any number of side hustles as a for instance. And that's so that you have the ability to stay relative to the industry and at the same time have flexibility and adaptability. I think as I tell you my story, that's probably one of the greatest aspects of how I've made my way, meaning Darwin didn't say that it's survival of the fittest, meaning the biggest, the baddest, the strongest. It's really the survival of the most adaptable, those creatures and us in our lives who can adjust. And some of that means exposing yourself to as many different opportunities as possible. So my beginning goes back to, like most of us, being captivated by music and its magic, having it move us and realizing that you want to express yourself. I was a fairly introverted kid. Drumming caught my attention. And so that's where I began, with several years of everything from the rudiments on through to getting the basic capabilities of reading. And so that, benefited me at a time where there were lots of bands during the 60s and 70s. It seemed like garage and basement bands left and right. So I was able to make friends. I was able to have places to play at that point, all types of teen dances, which the scene has changed so much. So some of what I have to say is not necessarily current, but I do know some of the current scene. I was, as a kid, exposed to a fair amount of technical influence. My father was a mechanical engineer. My uncle was an engineer for RCA in television and radio. And so those men were influential. Back in that time period, there was something called the Heathkit Company that you could buy your kids how to put circuits together. You could make a little transistor radio and such. So at the same time of being drawn to the power of music, I was also influenced by how music was made. How's it coming out of this little box of a speaker of a radio? And so I also was coming through a period of time where it went from recording as capturing a live performance into the studio being an instrument itself. The greats being, of course, George Martin, and then others after that, Alan Parsons, and folks who truly were able to create these recording experiences that were unheard of prior through recording techniques and advancements in the technology. So that really captured my attention, and I knew that I wanted to be in the recording area. Oddly enough, at that point in time, there were no recording schools per se. I went to Eastman, they had a summer clinic, and this is out of high school. And I thought, well, maybe I could go to Eastman. I really didn't have the chops to go to Eastman because I was a rock and roller primarily. I had the great experiences of playing everything from the three-chord garage band repertoire, on into that kind of blend it right into soul music. We were mostly focused. I lived in a town near the Ohio River, so the whole river town influence of Memphis soul, for instance, and Southern Muscle Shoals, and all of that was influential upon us in the Cincinnati area. And so that gravitated into here comes, the psychedelic era, and there again, unheard of, unearthly type sounds coming out of instruments. So I was blessed to kind of have a gumbo, if you will, of styles and influences through that period of time. I had the opportunity. My college band ended up getting a contract with a local studio in Indianapolis. That was a 16-track studio at that point in time, and then management went out and shopped it, and we ended up having a record contract, and we were no-hit wonders at that point. But it gave me the studio experience I was really looking for. The Eastman summer camp was really great because they had Phil Ramone as a guest,
Mm.
and they had another guy who was an engineer from the West Coast who'd recently done a lot of pop records. And so these were people who were giving insights to the actual studio experience. So to go from that into my band having that same experience was really good. So I didn't study music per se. I ended up going into radio and television as my major, and having music and speech, oddly enough, as my minors, so that I could really understand production processes and get to know. It's very similar in terms of bringing resources together and creating. And so shortly after my band broke up, I was in a radio and television station for a couple years. I happened to have an FCC license that I'd gathered along the way because I really thought the funny story is in my old little hometown, there was a single radio station there, and thinking I could get a job. And they go, no, kid, you need to have an FCC license to be on the air or to operate. And so I actually got a big, thick FCC guide and studied it. My parents at the age of 16 let me drive 5 hours to Chicago to the federal building and take the FCC exam. And I ended up passing the exam. And I come back home and I walk in to see if I could get a job. And they looked at me like, you're back? We didn't really mean it. We thought we were sending you away. But at any rate, that benefited me later because I had that FCC license as my band imploded. And so I was able to have an overnight job running a transmitter. And that ended up prepping the morning show on the radio station and running the radio station that was the automated station. And then I ended up getting my own show. And then I ended up, being the voice of various clients who would come in. And so I gravitated from the engineering side over to the production side. And that again gave me an opportunity with another guy who was at the station. We hit it off and we said we ought to form our own company because now we were starting to produce some things in-house for ourselves. And the station was going, well, they're not even our clients. And you're doing this work here. So we knew we were pushing their generosity. At any rate, so we formed a studio, which also ended up being was in a small, it was a mid-sized market, South Bend, Indiana, Notre Dame University, a fair amount of, it was about a 250,000 market. And so we ended up doing it all, and I ended up, drumming kind of. I got put out of business with drumming during the disco era. So if you can't fight them, I joined them, and I started doing DJing, and I did all kinds of, whether it was teen dances or whether because I was at the station, so I had a little notoriety, and then ended up doing club work along with recording everything from punk bands to country bands to you name it, anything that was in that market, gospel groups, and gosh, every kind of wannabe. And of course, we're doing jingles and things of that nature on the side. So that's really where my media music background started forming. And after about 5 or 6 years, I wanted to grow the business. My partner and I had some differences, and I realized I really ought to move on. So I decided that I would go towards the Chicago market, and I came to an agreement, a buyout agreement with him on that company. Went to Chicago and started. Fortunately, it was at a time period where a lot of recording technology was becoming much more affordable. Even our studio, it was probably several $100,000 worth of an investment to have the studio at that point in time. And the major Chicago studios, I would go in and get to know people and started freelancing, started building studios for others. So it was transitioning from, the Chicago Recording Company or Universal or Paragon, or the major studios that were pretty much $1 million type plants. Suddenly, here comes these semi-professional gear, the Tascams and what have you, Otari. And so my background on the tech side helped me make a living. And it was fun time to be in Chicago because something called house music was starting.
Mm.
And through my DJ experience, I had been scouted by the Marriott Corporation back in those days. Marriott's had actual bars and clubs attached to them. In the metro area, they had several disco clubs. And so I was scouted out for that and got a contract with the Marriott for Fort Wayne and South Bend locations and hopping into Chicago at times. So I got to know the whole DJ pool through, record pools. And that led me to get to know guys who were doing these warehouse gigs, basically raves in the early days of taking over an abandoned building and throwing a party and all night. So as I got to know those guys, and those guys started to, seek me out to say, hey, we're going to build a studio. We want to build it. We're building a nightclub. We're doing, they started to get formalized. So at the same time, I started this music for media publishing company right around there. So you could tell I was doing everything I could in Chicago to go from one end of town to the other with my head in a rack, building studios to getting to know the players and having sessions to recording some blues bands, to you name it. So again, that whole role of producer engineer was fascinating to me. And yeah, the music for media took off. We started syndicating our music, meaning building a catalog. Players that we would know would say, "Hey, I have some songs. Can you publish us?" And I'd say, "Sure. Give me more styles." And so that's kind of where some of the salesmanship kicked in. I think you have to have a little bit of, obviously, you have to have drive to be in the business. And so with that, you have to understand sales. And I will say that, sales gets an ugly reputation because of the used car salesman type of huckster or somebody trying to manipulate you. But there's a great book called To Sell Is Human. And along the way, I encountered that guy named Daniel Pink. And it really means we're really all naturally selling, you know. We're out to move people. That's really what the breakthrough is, to get over yourself about, you know, putting your best foot forward and asserting, hey, I think I have something for you. When you genuinely do, that certainly helps. So along the way, I got recognized by manufacturers who saw what I was doing, like, and saw that I was an influencer back before they even called anyone an influencer. And they would say, hey, put our stuff in your jobs. And as I was doing that, then before long, they said, why don't you contract with us, with specific manufacturers? So that started to introduce me to the whole equipment distribution and marketing area. And the guys who plucked me up from that, they themselves had similar backgrounds where they, gravitated into a role. And so that role started to give me not only wider regional exposure to work with people like a Jerry Milam, who was building studios for REO Speedwagon and Styx and all of the various bands of that Midwest rock and roll scene. But that then before long, I'm getting to meet all the other guys who do the similar thing in LA and New York and what have you. And before long, I'm at the New York Audio Engineering Society, hanging out at the Hilton, where, across the bar, you could see Donald Fagen huddled over there with some people and all these different folks. And so that was a fun time, because the record business was at its peak. And as a result, I met a guy. I was in a session. There was a panel discussion where a guy named Rick Derringer, who was a solo artist, but he was in a band called the McCoys from Indiana, and it's in my neighborhood. And he had played our town before. And so I knew his brother even better, because his brother would come out and see my band when we were on traveling throughout Ohio. And so I'm there to see him speak and say hi. And guy next to me is from San Francisco, and he holds up a new magazine called Mix Magazine. And his studio was on the cover. And he said, yeah, you got to come out and visit me. And I did. And he offered me work. And I didn't take the job at the time, but the coolest thing was that the studio manager he was going to have me replace, I got to interview him where he was going, and he was going further into the publishing business. So I did everything to pick his brain about publishing at a higher level than the syndication that I was doing. And so that gave me great insights into all of the, music supervisor area and the licensing of tracks. It also gave me insights because that particular studio had an artist, it was blowing up, an artist called George Winston, who was on a label called Windham Hill, which was all part of a new wave, a new age movement. There was a new wave movement too. But so that gave me insights to a ground level grassroots development, not unlike what was happening in Chicago with Wax Tracks and some of the industrial scene along with the house music scene. So, man, I just was able to navigate a lot of cool places that eventually led me to, hawking my wares in LA. Anytime I was in town for a NAMM show, or if I'd go to Vegas for the broadcast show, or I would basically spend a day when I slept on a friend's apartment floor for 2 weeks, making the rounds to Warner Brothers, Universal, and you name it. So as time passed, the publishing business, had its own regular recurring income because I'd gotten it out in enough places. But I was taxed to further any producing. So I would do some artist projects and what have you. But the technical side of the business was really taken off for me. So yeah, that's the general scope of how I got here. Now, I would continue to write. I relocated to San Francisco in 2008. And while I was out there, they have a great, well, it's a school. It was started out as a storefront, but now it's the California Jazz Conservatory. So jazz, obviously, since a lot of my background was in instrumental music to support program material, scoring, I found it real quizzical to me. I always use jazz players because they were very adept. You know, you could put a chart in front of them and you could interpret. They could jump styles very quickly and so expressive. And so kind of put me in the appreciation of the jazz scene, and jazz in and of itself is a rich language of tonality, harmonic. You know, it's adventurous, as we all know. And so I started studying, and I really wanted to figure out, you know, what makes a standard, first of all. Why are some of these songs just memorable masterpieces in the American songbook? And I also wanted to get into the level of harmonic structures so that I could write more of my own music rather than for others. And that's what I ended up doing now. So, yeah, just about 4 years ago, I started my own individual. I have two other artists that I work with in terms of collaborative work, but this project in particular probably had, gosh, dozens of people, primarily about 5 or 6 key collaborators, which is something that I want to encourage. Part of having collaboration, of course, is the synergy that comes out of that, the greater sum of the parts versus the individuals that are contributing. And so it's very kinetic. You know, it's an energy flow that you really can bounce off of each other, and you all know that you are contributing to making something shine. So I'm fairly big on collaboration. In part, I was also in, you know, being in the technology area. It wasn't long before, you know, I'm doing things for broadcast applications and I'm doing things for film studio and what have you. And it's not long before I was into the area of general communications. So that being, I was in the San Francisco area. And so I came upon this company called Zoom, and they happened to be in, of course, the early stages of computer-based video conferencing. I recognized them for what they were at one point in time, just to show you how diverse my portfolio got. I did a lot of consulting, design assistance for distance learning networks in education. So here I am doing this mixed bag of, and the cool thing was that I had all this portfolio, but I also had a lot of freedom and flexibility to work on this, now work on that, and multitask in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say like I'm very big on multi streams of income, and you've clearly done that throughout your experience. How do you balance that? I think that's where musicians struggle a little bit, I think, because it's like if you're doing too many things, sometimes you can't really put the focus in on the thing that you need to focus on, whether it's like your own artist career, because you've got all these things going on, yet you probably need that in order to make the income that you need from music.
Most definitely. You know, a lot of folks end up teaching and performing or other hybrids. I mean, there's the areas of, you know, working in a box office at a theater that, you know, or other working for a promoter. Back in the day, I worked for our own booking agent. You know, he would have band members come in and cover the phones or pick up the phone and book your band. You know, they didn't know that they were talking to me, the guy who's actually in the band that I'm
Mm.
promoting, or one of the bands that I knew. So how do you do it? I think you have to have a balanced set of interest that complement each other. Number one, like I said, the people that I worked for, I was kind of a hired gun in almost all situations up until the point where finally the company that I was with a partner that understood everything that I had in my wheelhouse, he accepted me. He says, you're the creative guy. You make things happen from the marketing standpoint and from, creativity of contacts and events we would do and collaborations. So I think you need to have no more than a couple major irons in the fire. Even though I mention all those things, they were all happening at different stages. And so I think that you have to still afford yourself the time to step back from music. For me, actually became my meditation time almost. You know what I mean? That the writing and getting away from other activities helped me keep my wits together. And so it's a trick. There's no doubt about that. You have to look at pretty seriously the realization of your potential and what areas of interest actually are viable offers. I think you want to put together something of an irresistible offer. And well, what is that? Well, you have to consider, even for making music, you have to consider your audience's profile, if you will, but you also have to look at what their pain points are. What is it that you can speak to that they go, this artist is really saying something. So understanding your audience is an important area of looking at their interest and their passions, their desires and aspirations, and what they love that you have a commonality with. It's a real transferable skill. So no matter what else you're doing, you're building up your own personal presence, your own personal brand. What is it that you are always ready to offer in a helpful way? And I think I could speak to perhaps some failing of artists in terms of experience design. So while I was in all of this area, I met a fella by the name of Joe Pine. I was doing some consulting work for a young guy, young 30 something guy, had a company, and I was doing some of his market development, and the pandemic set in, and there wasn't going to be any broadcast show convention. There wasn't the National Association of Broadcasters. There wasn't going to be the non-broadcast Infocom show, where at the Infocom show you have everything from guys who do rigs for disco nightclubs to, you name it, corporate work. And so we thought we would do a Zoom-based mini day, full day conference of workshops. And I was telling them, well, this is a really different experience. We ought to get this guy who wrote this book called The Experience Economy. And so it was a pivotal book in the area of marketing in around 2000, because it went from the typical selling at people to involving people. And I bring this up from a standpoint of raising your consciousness as a musician in terms of creating an experience with your tribe, with your set of folks that come out to see you. And so experience design has become something that is probably most prevalent in its initial stages with the Apple Store. People didn't go to the Apple Store to be sold. They went there to be immersed in talking to other users, hands-on experience, going to the Genius Bar, having associates float around and guide you why one versus another device might work for you and all that sort of thing. So it ended up being kind of like a temple of technology. It had so much reverence going for it. And it only instilled what was already there in the Apple brand, that they originally went after creatives, intentionally. And they also went after teachers, so they decided to go after two market segments, if you will. And so I I found that Joe, this guy I was working with, he came back to say a week later, he's in our planning, he goes, well, I got Joe Pine. He's going to join us. He thinks it's going to be great. And I go, oh, okay. So I got to know Joe firsthand and got to understand his principles of creating an experience. He now is working on a book, and it's been a lot of fun because I'm inside of his Substack group, And he's literally writing the book on Substack,
Mm.
literally a living document with people feeding back thoughts about it, and it's a very highly collaborative experience. So the thing I think that applies to that is understanding, having an empathy for your audience, but also, involving them. They're not just coming to sit and watch you play. They're there to have their interest aroused. They're there for you to challenge them a little bit. And so we're entering an age of immersive technologies, the Van Gogh show and these other things. And there's a lot of people looking at how music is going to come into that arena. And I think you can do it on smaller scales, as a for instance. Now, with that said, a lot of what you've shown people, because you have entrepreneur within your banner, is the multidiscipline that it takes nowadays. It's kind of a shame in a way. Now you can still make it on music mastery. You know what I mean? If you're that dedicated, don't water things down. Don't get too diverse in your side hustles. Like really, there's still one of the things he got into it for was to be in awe. And some people are so awesome in their musicality and their artistry that comes across. So I'm not talking about having gimmicks when I talk about experience. I'm just talking about a mindset of inclusion, a mindset of doing some things that are beyond the music experience itself and giving music a context. I happen to have as a project, it's called As I Recall Forever, and it was basically built around me looking at these dots in my life and connecting those dots and seeing what was at work there. And I go, man, these are like my forever moments. And so we have forever innately deep within our human psyche. And from that, I went, okay, why? And why are these particular people that I met, conditions I was brought into, things I encountered, why are they indelibly etched on my soul? You know, and you start to figure that there's something higher power at work, which is also part of the creative process as well. So for me, there's a real spiritual side to everything that I encountered. And some of that I think can be the basis, the, if you will, the kernel, a kernel from a programming standpoint, that key operating set for your operating system. It can be the kind of thing that gets you through doubts and fears and what have you. And so being in that flow state, if you will, a place where, so often you hear people, artists of all kinds, but people just say, man, this song like wrote itself. Well, yes, because you put yourself into that openness and you allowed it to take you there. So you were kind of guided in that process. So I think that's an important area of personal development that goes along with your artistry. And I haven't quite exactly answered your question about the balance of this. In some cases, I'm certain that people, in fact, I know I had a guy who came to work with me and he said he was talking to an associate from Nashville, a counterpart, and he tells me, yeah, Wally said I ought to be careful because you guys are workaholics. So, yeah, it takes a little obsession, yet, but you also don't want to ruin your personal life
Hmm.
by ignoring ones you love, friends, family, because they're the network that you also use. Besides the collaboration network that you have, the more people you collaborate with, it means you have more people with something at stake in your project development.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I really gathered from your story is, the dots. A lot of them relate to people that you met along the way, relationships that you made, turns that happened in your career that you wouldn't have expected only because you met this person or you went to this place and got a sense of, these people and what they were doing. So
Oh
maybe you
yeah.
could just speak real quick about that. Like, how do you how do you be open to all those new relationships? And again, with like knowing when to say yes and when to say no.
Curiosity, I think it's a major asset because people will be able to see that you have their interest at heart, that you're asking lots of questions. I would say questions are the answer to almost every one of those encounters because you just have to know what somebody's about, and you just have to know how do you have similar complementary sometimes experiences, or how do you have contrasting ones where you can go, wow, I didn't realize this or that, and I've grown by knowing somebody. So you have to look at blessings that are coming right to you, and figure out how to, separate the wheat from the chaff. In other words, you're going to meet a lot of semi hucksters, a lot of BSers. It's an ego business. But I can tell you the people, I'll cite one of them, a guy named Max Bennett, who's a bass player. Now, Max played the bass on a song called Fever.
Mm.
Doom, ba-doom, ba-doom, boom, ba-doom, boom. Okay. So he also was in a band called Tom Scott and the LA Express. Now I'm giving you dated references, so forgive me. I mean, this is before probably many people were born in this listening to this. But regardless, he was a major dude in some respects. In terms of, he played on Frank Zappa's Hot Rats. He he was a session guy who had an array of things, and I'm trying to remember the connection, but I contacted him and I just said, I license music and I like what you're doing. Do you have anybody who represents you? And he was from Nebraska, and here I am, a guy coming from the Midwest, and he just took to me like a big brother. You know what I mean? That And I said, I'll do my best. And he says, well, we're trying to put something together that we hope to get released in Japan because Japan is big in jazz. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll help underwrite the project so that I could have the publishing. And that was the beginning of a relationship that had me staying at his, Santa Clara house up on the hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And so I'm trying to think of an example of here I am now with a guy who had Snoop Dogg take one of his songs, and it was the foundation of one of his raps. And so we made some money together, but more importantly, he had an affinity for me. And after a while, I just shook my head like, why? And it's just because this happened with another person I knew. And I said, why are we working together? And he goes, you're real.
Mm.
He said, you're from the Midwest.
Yeah.
And he said, you just, what you see is what you get. So that's one of the things. I don't think you need to be assertive, most certainly. You know what I mean? And you need to be, and I think gosh, I think of Susie Savita Jones at Warner Brothers, and because I told her after a while with the things she was giving me, I said, should I move out here? And she goes, no, I'll keep giving you work. Don't. You won't be able to raise a family, da 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 da. And even when I went to Chicago, I met a guy, and he goes, why do you want to be in this snake pit? This was like downtown Michigan Avenue, where all of the major production area was for ad agency world. And I didn't know any better. And I just kept at it.
Well, I love that the first thing that you said, that you're curious, right? I think that's my experience with being a podcaster too. It's like I meet so many people doing this, and some people we super hit it off, and we continue our relationship for years. And yeah, I have people in this industry I've known now for 10 years. When I started back in 2014 or even before that, with online radio, and it's like you just click, right? But you got to be open to it, and you never know where that's going to take you. There are people that I'm doing stuff with now that I never knew 10 years ago when we had our first conversation that would happen. So I agree, like being curious, being open, and being yourself, and being assertive is also very important. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to make sure that people can contact you because you've got such a breadth of experience, and maybe you can help artists to try to see like where their next pivot is, or where they could be open to expanding their career a little bit, especially if they're an artist who's trying to figure out how to finance their career. So how can they connect with you online?
Well, my current project is asIrecallforever.com.
Okay.
That is this musical podcast. Like I said, I'd put together as many as 25 songs over 3 years. And I was figuring out, what am I doing? And then I finally realized there is no format for long form music,
Mm,
concept albums, if you will. That's what it ended up being. And so I said, well, there are streaming programs people watch on Netflix, binge watch even, and there are podcasts. So I decided to make a podcast musical out of it. And my point of saying that is that try to give your music context. And that also ties into the experience development that I was talking about. But to give your music context means to put something together thematically, or it could be with a cause and other things. That it's a way of taking what you've got and bottling it, if you will. So that's what I'm doing behind this project, taking a different spin, because let's face it, recorded music revenue opportunities are shamefully fractions of what they used to be when we had physical media. So I also grew up in that era and was blessed to have that, you know. But it's a big changing time with implementing social media strategies and all that other stuff that you kind of carry. So the name of the group I put together, because it wasn't really a solo project. After long, I'm dealing with all the people I knew through my career. I'm calling people up. I'm bringing them into, and therefore getting to know others one after another. And I have a lot of great mid-level type folks on my stuff. Some are names. A guy who, once I had it all done, I was doing all of the singing, and I went, I don't want to do all these. So those scratch tracks, I'm going, I want to get some other singers involved. And I thought of a guy that I know. He knows me, though we never worked together, and I know people he's worked with. So I called one. I said, what do you think he would think of this song, singing it for me? And she said, yeah, go show him. And I did. And he writes back to say, this is masterful stuff. And I go, whoa, does that mean you're in? And so Tim Davis is the guy, and he was the music director for the program Glee.
nice.
So he says, well, Bill, not only I see you're adding other singers to have a diverse set of folks in this production. Kind of, again, I'll go back to Alan Parsons' project where he would put together, you know, players and singers, and there's been other attempts of things like this. At any rate, yeah. So he said, "I'll do all the casting. I have a whole set of people that I think you should bring into this," and so he helped me do that. So
That's
yeah,
awesome. So tell me again, what is the URL that they can go to for that?
they can go to asIrecallforever.com, all one word, of
Got it.
course. And you can also go to The Next Humanity, which is the name of the collaborative group. I wanted to give
Awesome.
it its own identity. And then the parent company's SIG Music, SIG Music is probably the quickest thing to remember. But anyway, uh,
Perfect. All
those
right.
are the
So
sites.
definitely you guys go check that out. I love that he's using the podcast medium for a long play album. Like it is true that that used to be the thing, like the coolest thing that you could listen to. And now, streaming's kind of changed the game. So I love the idea of it being a podcast. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. Bill,
Thanks.
it's been so great for you to share all of your knowledge and experience with us. Thank
Well,
you so
Bree,
much.
I salute what you're doing, because it's good to have information, and it's good to have folks who have some tested means of survival, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what we try to provide here. So thank you so much for all of your expertise today.
Thanks for listening to the Profitable Musician Show. I would love to know your takeaways and aha moments from this episode. Leave me a comment over at profitablemusician.com so I can bring you more of the information, interviews, and resources that you love. Thanks to Rondi Fay, one of my Academy members, for providing the music for our podcast. You can check her out at rondifay.com. That's RANDIFAY.com. Just remember, knowledge is power, but without implementation, it is useless. And inspiration without action is merely entertainment. But I know you're not just a dreamer, you are a doer. And I promise I'll be here every week to support you and remind you that you can be a profitable musician.